What will you do when your life is crumbling before your eyes? Will you fight or will you accept your fate? What if that person who is ruining your life is the one you loved the most? These were the thoughts that had kept me going for the past few weeks. My life, which until recently had seemed normal, if not routine, was suddenly starting to come apart at the seams. Yesterday was the last straw. I learnt the truth, and that truth changed me forever. Alla, my wife, the woman I had once dreamed of a future with, had betrayed me in the most vile way. She didn't just cheat on me, she gave me someone else's child and made me believe that I was the father. For 3 years I lived a lie, deceiving myself, trusting her and working endlessly to support her and the baby. I was a blind idiot.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
This morning was strange. I looked at Sarah sitting by the window in an old dressing gown, her hair in disarray, her face pale and haggard. She no longer resembled the well-groomed and attractive woman who had won me over a few years ago. Lately, her life had centered around her phone and social media, where she flirted with her lover while I toiled at work trying to earn money for our house. Now, knowing the truth, I felt nothing but cold disgust for her. But it wasn't over. No, her downfall was just beginning. She had no idea I knew. Her phone last night, left unattended on the couch, was the key to exposing her double life. I stared at the screen for a long time, at the pop-up messages from her friend, and internally simmered. Now, realizing everything that was going on behind my back, the only thing I felt was cold, merciless rage. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to talk to her. I had another plan. One that she would never recover from. Our relationship wasn't always like this. When we met, Sarah was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. She was active, full of life, always up for something new. We laughed a lot, made plans for the future. I loved her so much that I was willing to do anything to make her happy. We got married and everything seemed perfect. I worked hard to provide for both of us, and then the baby came. The baby became the center of our world. I was happy despite the fatigue and the constant responsibilities. But as the days went by, I began to notice Sarah changing. She stopped taking an interest in the house, didn't cook, didn't clean. She spent more and more time on her phone, withdrew into herself. At first I tried to put it down to postpartum depression, fatigue. I told myself it would pass, that we just needed time. But it wouldn't go away. It got worse every day. Sarah started to get irritated at every little thing. I'd come home from work, exhausted and tired, and there'd be dirt, shouting and total indifference. She didn't even bother to talk, just threw irritated looks and went into the other room with her phone in her hands. It became our new norm. I put up with it. Tolerated until yesterday. Sarah's phone turned out to be my key to the truth. That night when she went to bed, I accidentally saw a message on the screen. Not on purpose, it just popped up. "Miss you," it said. At that moment, something in my chest shivered. I picked up her phone, my heart beating at a frantic pace, and started scrolling through the messages. There was another man she was flirting with and then openly texting. I read their conversations where they discussed meeting, where he asked about our baby. She would answer him that their baby would start talking soon. I froze. Inside everything was screaming, but on the outside I was calm. I was slowly realizing that this baby was not mine. Sarah wasn't just cheating on me. She had fathered a child, and like the ultimate fool, I had spent 3 years feeding someone else's baby, thinking it was my child. I couldn't believe it. First there was denial, then there was anger. I wanted to storm into the bedroom, wake her up and scream the truth in her face. But no. I should have been smarter than that. I decided to make her realize she'd lost everything she once had. I didn't just want to punish her, I wanted her to feel the full weight of her betrayal. The next morning I got up earlier than usual, but I didn't wake Sarah. Let her think it was business as usual. I showered, made myself a coffee and sat in the kitchen, thinking about how to put my plan into action. She was going to lose everything. She was used to living off me, used to me paying all the bills, buying everything she needed. Sarah had never worked, never planned to work. Now she's going to see what it's like to be unsupported. First, I cut off her access to our bank accounts. All the credit cards she had access to were blocked. I called the bank and warned them to reject any attempts to use our joint accounts. She suspected nothing as I built my retribution step by step. After work, I stopped by the law firm. We drew up the property division papers. I kept the house, as well as everything I'd bought with my money. Her stuff, old rags, cosmetics and a phone, that's all she'd get. I warned her I was going to file for divorce and demand a paternity test. After that, nothing awaits her but the streets. When I got home, Sarah was sitting with her phone in her hands as usual, unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. I walked into the house, trying to keep a calm expression on my face. Sarah didn't even pay me any attention, engrossed in yet another endless feed on her phone. Our house, which had once been a place of comfort and tranquility, now resembled a ruin. There were things lying everywhere, kids' toys scattered on the floor, dirty dishes in the kitchen. But I didn't care about that anymore. There was revenge ahead. Sitting down at the kitchen table, I made myself a cup of coffee and watched her. She looked as if the world hadn't touched her at all. Sloppy hair, crumpled t-shirt, the same dressing gown she'd worn for days on end. Yesterday it had only irritated me, but today it was grimly satisfying. She would lose everything. But so far, she didn't suspect a thing. I decided to start small. A simple conversation that would seem harmless, but was in fact the first step in the collapse of her life. "Sarah," I began calmly, taking a sip of coffee. "We need to talk." She looked up at me, eyes full of fatigue and irritation. Maybe she was expecting another complaint about the messy house or the fact that she hadn't made dinner again. But that didn't matter tonight. Things went much deeper than that. "About what?" she asked indifferently, not looking away from the phone. "About us," I paused, choosing my words carefully. "And the future." Sarah snorted, but put the phone aside. "What did you have in mind again?" Her voice was soaked with indifference. "Have you ever thought about making a change?" I continued, watching her reaction carefully. "You haven't worked for a long time, the house isn't in order, I'm always at work. Don't you think it's time you took responsibility for your life?" She frowned, clearly not expecting such a topic of conversation. "I'm on maternity leave," she said, as if that was supposed to be the universal excuse for everything. "And what do you suggest? Where would I go with a baby?" "The baby's big enough," I tried not to give myself away. "You could at least get a part-time job. I don't have to do all the work. We're a family, aren't we?" Sarah hesitated, not knowing how to answer. There was a look of surprise on her face, mixed with a little fear. She'd always thought that I would provide for her forever, that my role was to be the breadwinner. But now her confidence was beginning to fade. "Come on," she tried to laugh, but clumsily. "You said you were fine. And what makes you think I have to work all of a sudden? We had an agreement." "We had an agreement when I thought it was my baby," I cut her off abruptly. Her face went pale, and she froze in place. That was the phrase that changed everything. I saw her stiffen in an instant. Her eyes widened with horror, and she swallowed nervously. What do you mean?" She finally squeezed out, trying to keep her composure. I stepped forward, looking her straight in the eye, and said each word with icy clarity. "I know that child is not mine. And I know who you've been seeing all this time. Everything you've been building up, all your lies, is over now." Sarah turned even paler, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth, trying to say something, but no words came out. This was the moment I'd been waiting for a long time. She realized that her world had collapsed and now she would have to face reality. "Ivan, it's not true," she started, but I didn't let her finish. "You don't even have to try to justify yourself," I interrupted her. "I've seen all your correspondence. I know everything. There's no point in lying anymore." Sarah was silent, her eyes darting around the room like a hunted animal. I could see the fear and despair slowly filling her mind. She realized that her world, built on lies and betrayal, was beginning to crumble. What are you going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I stood up and walked over to her, looking down at her. "I'm going to make you lose everything," I said with cold calmness. "The house, the money, the comfortable life. You're not going to live off me anymore. You're going to be left with what you deserve." Sarah jumped up, clearly realizing I wasn't joking. "Ivan, please." She rose from her chair, her voice filled with panic. "You can't just throw us out on the street." "I can," I answered without a shadow of emotion. "And I'm going to do it." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in shock. I left Sarah in the kitchen in utter confusion. Her world was beginning to crumble, and she hadn't yet fully realized the gravity of her situation. But I didn't care. The anger that had long been building up inside now felt like an icy wall between us. I was sure of my every action. Sarah didn't immediately rush after me, but a few minutes later, when I was already in the bedroom, she burst in, her face twisted with fear and panic. "Ivan, we can talk about this," she shouted, grabbing my arm. "You don't understand. It's not what you think it is." I pulled away from her, restraining myself from exploding. "Discuss? You want me to discuss with you how you've been lying to my face all day? Do you really think I'm going to talk to you after what I found out? I made a mistake." Her voice was shaking, she was almost crying. "But I love you, Love me?" I grinned coldly. "Do you love me so much that you gave birth to another man? Or love me so much that you lived with him behind my back for 3 years, taking advantage of my kindness? No, Sarah. You don't love me. You only love yourself." She wrapped her arms around her head. She didn't seem to know what to say. Her tears now made me feel nothing but contempt. "I'm the mother of your child," she shouted, as if that would make a difference. I gave her a look of cold contempt. "You are the mother, but not of my child," I replied. "And don't you dare use that as an argument anymore. I don't owe you anything anymore. Not to you or your baby." Sarah sat down on the bed, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs. But her tears didn't touch me anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt relieved that I was finally free of this lie. "What will happen now?" she whispered through her tears, not looking up at me. I stood at the door with my arms folded across my chest, looking down at her. "It's the way it has to be now," I said. "I'm going to file for divorce. And you're going to have to leave. You're used to living on my money, but that comfort is over. You'll go to work, you'll finally realize what real life is. You're gonna have to take care of yourself and your baby. I'm not your support anymore." Sarah looked up at me with eyes full of terror. "Where am I going to go?" she whispered. "I don't have anyone." I shrugged my shoulders. "That's not my problem anymore," I replied. "You made your choice. Now live with the consequences." I left the room, leaving her to sit in silence. My heart no longer ached. I felt only the satisfaction of finally taking my life in my hands. She had lost everything she had and could no longer count on me. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet. I hadn't heard Sarah, and admittedly, I didn't care where she was. I had already taken all the necessary steps to put an end to our relationship. I'd sent the lawyer the paperwork to start divorce proceedings and contacted the bank to block all her cards. This time I didn't plan to back down. I sat down at the table with a cup of coffee and savored this quiet moment. For a long time the house had been filled with chaos, scandals, and false promises. Now, however, I felt peace. This house was becoming mine again. Soon Sarah appeared in the kitchen. Her face swollen with tears, her hair disheveled. She looked even worse than yesterday. She looked at me as if she was waiting for the final blow. "Ivan," she began quietly, "are you really going to kick me out?" I looked at her without an ounce of regret. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "You can stay here for the rest of the week, but then you'll have to leave." Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I won't be able to. I don't know how to live without you," she whispered. "You should have thought of that before," I replied coldly. "You're on your own now." She continued to cry, but I was no longer the person to comfort her. Sarah herself had destroyed everything we had. Now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. I finished my coffee and left the house, leaving her crying in the kitchen. When I got home from work the next day, the house was a mess, just as it had been before. Sarah had done nothing to remedy the situation, even though she had had a whole night and morning to tidy it up at least a little. This only confirmed my fears that she would continue to rely on other people's help without making any effort. I entered the house and saw that she was still sitting in the kitchen where I had left her that morning. Bags and boxes were now scattered around her. She had tried to pack her things, but it was done very sloppily. There was no determination or desire for change in her actions, just panic and indecision. It annoyed me, but I tried to remain calm. "How's the packing going?" I asked, walking into the kitchen. My tone was neutral, almost indifferent. She flinched and turned to me, fear in her eyes. "I'm trying," she said, her voice shaking. "But I don't know where to start. I have no money, no place to live. And what am I going to do with a baby?" I leaned back in my chair, watching her. I found it hard to believe that this was the same woman with whom I had once made plans for the future. Her current appearance was a reminder of how much she'd ruined everything. "You already knew the consequences of your actions wouldn't be easy," I said. "Now you're going to see what it means to be in difficult circumstances. I'm not going to solve your problems for you." She was silent, trying to collect her thoughts. I noticed her hands shaking as she packed. Satisfaction was growing inside me that I had brought her to this state. Now she was going to have to face what real life was like without my financial support. A few more days passed, and not only had Sarah not improved her situation, but she was in an even bigger crisis. She couldn't find a place to live because flat rentals required an upfront payment and a steady income, and she had neither. I watched her agony from afar, feeling that all the measures taken had worked. I continued to go to work each morning, but my job no longer seemed so torturous. I now knew that another step in the process of divorce and further proceedings awaited me at home. I planned to file for divorce as soon as possible, and each trip to the law office brought me closer to the end of the story. Thoughts often came to me about how much easier it would be if I could just forget everything and start over. But that would have been too easy. Revenge was too sweet to give up halfway through. One day when I got home, I saw Sarah sitting on the couch in the living room. The room was quiet, and I noticed that the baby was sleeping in the other room. Sarah looked exhausted, but something in her demeanor had changed. She was no longer crying, but just sitting there as if immersed in her thoughts. Her eyes were tired, but there was no longer the fear I had seen before. "Ivan," she said at last, "I've decided that something has to change. I have nowhere to go, and I don't have any money. I realize you're not going to help me. I'm just asking for some time to get settled on my feet." I stood in front of her, weighing her words. There was no pity or manipulation in her request, just sincerity and a real awareness of her situation. This sincerity was a new step in her life, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to change my plans. "I have an opportunity to help you, but on my terms," I said. "I can give you another week. Find a place to live and a job. If you don't, I'll have to file papers with the court to expedite the divorce." She nodded, and there was hope in her eyes. I wasn't going to go back to her or change my mind, but at least temporarily I could give her a chance to right her wrongs. It was the last gesture of kindness I could afford before finally cutting off all ties. The remaining days passed quickly. Sarah did try to find a place to live and a job, but she was unable to solve all the problems. She continued to exhibit effort, but that effort was clearly not enough to change her fate in the short term. With each passing day, I watched her struggle, as she tried to take steps that seemed impossible a few weeks ago. I saw her attempts to find a job, how she searched for cheap accommodation, how she finally found a part-time job to survive somehow. When it came time for the final decision, I showed no sympathy whatsoever. I signed all the necessary divorce papers and sent them to the court. These papers were the final step in finally ending this chapter of my life. Sarah left the house as agreed. She took her belongings and left for the new place she had managed to find. I was no longer her carer and put a stop to what had started 3 years ago. As I looked at the empty flat we used to live in, I was relieved. All the problems that had once been associated with Sarah were now gone. I was free from her deceptions, her lies, and all the complications she had brought into my life. Every now and then I thought about the fact that I now had the opportunity to start over. The revenge I had so carefully planned was now complete. I was free from the weight of the past and ready for new beginnings. Since Sarah had left, my life had taken on a calmness and order I hadn't known in a long time. I focused on work and began to rebuild my financial health. I began to feel like a person in control of my life again, not just tormented by other people's mistakes. At first it was hard to get used to being alone. But over time, I learned to enjoy the silence that reigned in the house. I began to spend more time on my hobbies and socializing with friends I hadn't seen in a while. The time I used to spend solving other people's problems was now filled with more enjoyable activities. One day, as I sat down to dinner, the thought came to me that perhaps it was time to take stock of everything that had happened. I sat down at my desk and began to write down my reflections. These notes became a kind of therapy, helping me to realize that it had not all been for nothing. Every time I thought back to how Sarah had tried to manipulate me, I had mixed feelings. It was hard to believe that she could really sink so deeply into deception and lies. I often wondered what might have happened if I hadn't found proof of her cheating. Perhaps I would have continued to live in an illusion, wasting my resources and time on someone who didn't deserve it. I also realized that my revenge was not just an act of retaliation, but a necessary step towards rebuilding my own life. It was a liberation not only for me, but for her as well. The change in her status and responsibilities helped her realize what it meant to be independent, and perhaps it was necessary for her own growth. When the divorce was finalized, I felt like I was finally closing this chapter. Now I had the opportunity to focus on my future life and build it without the problems that had arisen from my relationship with Sarah. I made the decision to move to a new flat to finally get a fresh start. Moving was not only a physical act, but also a symbolic one. I got rid of old things and memories that reminded me of the past. The new house became a symbol of a new beginning for me. I began to refurnish it, choosing only those things that reflected my personality and taste. It was a process of not only creating a new space, but also forming a new identity. Soon after moving in, I started meeting new people. It wasn't easy as I still maintained a distrust of people, but gradually I began to open up. Meeting new people and making new acquaintances helped me to believe in human kindness and sincerity again. I found satisfaction in the simple pleasures of life and began to realize that all difficulties were just steps on the way to something greater. One day at a social gathering I met Christy, a woman who caught my attention with her sincerity and kindness. At first it was just a friendship, but over time I noticed our feelings begin to deepen. She wasn't like Sarah, there was no falseness or manipulation in her. Christy was real and honest, and that helped me to believe in love again. Things developed naturally with Christy. We started spending more time together doing simple things that brought joy. I became an open and honest person in her presence, and this strengthened our relationship. We shared dreams, future plans, and supported each other. Our relationship was a new beginning for me. I learned to trust and love again, knowing that true love requires honesty and openness. Christy became an important part of my life, and I felt like I had finally found what I had been looking for so long. The revenge I had once craved was no longer my goal. I realized that true freedom and satisfaction does not come from destroying another person's life, but from creating my own, happy and fulfilling one. The past was behind me, and I was ready to move forward with a new understanding and new goals. This story was a painful lesson, but one that I embraced and learned important lessons from. In the end, everything that happened led me to a new understanding of life and to become a better person than I was before. I was ready to start a new chapter of my life, full of hope and possibilities.